Thanks, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first EDGE session of the morning. Hope everyone's alert with plenty of coffee. We're going to have a fast, quick-moving session. It's not a panel discussion. It's an EDGE session. If you don't know what an EDGE session is, I didn't either until they told me. An EDGE session is essentially an alternative format. Instead of discussing a well-known issue, we're going to discuss frontiers in the development industry. We're going to discuss suburban development today and the role of innovation in those suburban places. So our format's going to be novel, quick moving. I'll discuss that in a second. Let me talk briefly about suburbia. Suburbia, as we know, has traditionally been a frontier of the city. It was initially beyond the edge of the city. Single land uses and low densities, that's a traditional image of suburbia. But starting in the 1980s, suburbia began to change. Suburbia, in a sense, has now become sometimes more urban than city itself. Boston's an unusual example of the urban-suburban relationship, of course. It wasn't empty land outside of the city. Some of Boston's suburbs are older than Boston itself. So it's not surprising that in Boston today, we're testing out urban innovations in suburbs at a rate that's sometimes faster than we see in cities themselves. We've got an energetic, talented, and fresh set of faces up here today to discuss this issue. They're going to provide their insights on the suburban redevelopment of the future. In the center, Kyle Corkum, managing partner at L-Star, based in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. But Kyle's a Boston area native. He goes to the Red Sox. He's driving a smart suburb development here called Union Point that we'll hear more about. Far right, Jenny Larios Berlin, an executive co-founder of Optimus Ride, a self-driving vehicle tech company. And I think we can safely call Optimus one of the many MIT-founded ventures, since both principals are graduates of my own school, the School of Architecture and Planning. Wanted to note that for eternity. Ellen Roybal, directly to my left, joining us from GE Solar, where she's Managing Director of Strategy and Market Intelligence, driving the use of renewables in the commercial and industry sectors. Last but not least, Jake Alkensklaus, both a product manager at Liberty Mutual's Solaria Labs and a City of Newton counselor. So he's getting rare insight into the public-private dynamic and interface with respect to innovative places. Briefly discuss the format. EDGE sessions are not panels, so rather than having each person present in turn on a chosen area of expertise, I'm going to raise several different topics, and I'm going to have all four of the guests weigh in on each of those topics, ad-libbing, as it were. Given time limits, we're going to have about 10 minutes per topic. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And we've got some visuals as well, and our guests can feel free to speak to those visuals if they like, or they're just up here for you to get a sense of what we're talking about when they speak. But we're going to concentrate on the discussion. So let's go. Any questions from my guests?
Ready.
Let's talk first and foremost about space. Suburbia is a spatial idea. Why? Why are we thinking of suburbs with respect to innovation space? What sort of opportunities are suburbs offering, and what's new about suburban space? Let's start with Kyle.
Thank you. So Union Point is located just 12 miles south of the financial district in Boston. But as Professor Ryan said, it's one of the oldest parts of the country. Many of the towns very close and within our property are nearing their 400th birthday. They're actually older than Boston. And so it's the part of the country that was developed first. The roads were laid out by farmers with, horse-drawn carriages. They didn't anticipate a lot of vehicle traffic and high-density development. And so, one person had said to me once that if our country was developed west to east instead of east to west, we would live in the state of New England. And Union Point would be in the city of Boston. And it's true of a lot of the big cities that are in the west. I don't know if they got lazy out there or what, but here we take a lot of pride in every single little town. I live in a town of 8,500 people. I've only lived there a year, but I already identify with us being different from the people in the next town. So the notion of building something even close to a city out there is pretty preposterous, except that the Navy acquired all this land before World War II in anticipation of war needs, and they built a Navy base there, but it was closed 20 years ago. And so the potential of this place was unlocked 20 years ago. What do you do with 1,500, 1,600 acres this close to the city? But it's incongruous. In the suburbs of Boston, you have office parks and you might have apartment buildings, but you don't have anything more urban. And so when the local political officials asked us, we were handpicked for this project, they asked us to figure out a way to do that. The conception had been just office park and housing as two things that sit side by side, because that's what everyone knew. And the challenge for us was to start to conceive of a real urban place that is incongruous but really is needed right now.
Why are suburbs a site for innovation? What about Newton? Jake?
My perspective is a little different because we don't have a blank slate like Kyle does. We're a very well-developed inner suburb of Boston. And the first concept that comes to mind with innovation in Newton is just human capital. There's a prevailing trope, I think, that all the best and brightest are flocking to the cities. If you look at the demographic data, that's actually not quite true. Actually, the rate of people going to the suburbs to buy homes is at historical averages, and there's really no big mass migration to the cities of the best and brightest. Because there's a historical trend around Boston of the schools being exceptionally good, Newton, Brookline, Cambridge, Somerville all have high quality schools, Watertown, Wellesley. It's become this virtuous cycle where well-educated people who want to invest in their kids and get their kids a great education are moving out there. And then those kids themselves are getting an awesome education and being prepared for success, and then they come back and do the same thing. We have in Newton just a tremendously talented population. The average number of patents per 1,000 people is 1 nationally. In Newton, it's 8.5. Just last year, we honored in the city council 2 different Nobel laureates who lived in Newton. It's pretty stunning. We have a biotech safety committee in the city that's just kind of volunteer engagement. And I was joking with them when they came in that they walked in to give us advice and they could leave with a Series A of $50 million. I mean, these people are just absolute rock stars in their respective biotech fields. So we got to, but the problem is they all leave Newton every day and go to work in Boston or Somerville or wherever else. We got to find a way to tap into that human capital in Newton and have an economic development engine in the city that we can tax and prosper from.
Great, so we've got the human capital out there, we've got the land and the space, sometimes space that's being repurposed, it's already been used for one purpose, it's there to be used again. Ellen or Jenny, any additional perspectives on suburbia as a space?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the self-driving tech industry, everybody's always wondering how soon are we going to get self-driving vehicles in my neighborhood, you know, when can I get my own and all these kinds of things. But the trajectory for self-driving vehicles is not linear. There's many different ways that this technology is going to get out into the world. And at least from Optimus Ride's perspective, it is actually in these more medium scale density, medium scale complexity when you look at the street infrastructure. And then it's going to be an incremental growth. I think for the organizations that are saying, oh yes, I'll be in Central Square, and then I'll drive from Central Square autonomously all the way down to Broadway in New York, you're going to see several years of development still to go. But we see these types of developments where you're working with the developer to design the infrastructure and really build an autonomous friendly ecosystem. That's where you're going to see this type of technology really coming out fast and furious. And as a result, these neighborhoods are the ones that are going to be the thought leaders about how to facilitate this type of technology. And so for us, you know, we're really excited to have that opportunity to grow, develop, and show what this technology can do as far as, you know, mobility, accessibility, and really connecting people, not just within their community, but also to the commuter rail. I think that that's another great opportunity in the suburban space is, you know, we have this commuter rail system, and how do we invest in it? Well, we have to increase the usage of it. And a simple way to do that is to enable the infrastructure that currently exists by providing first and last mile solutions. And so that's, I think, another great opportunity where the AV industry can really provide support and be a complement to the infrastructure that already exists. It's not a competition from our perspective. It's more, how do we think about sustainable solutions that can help all communities.
And I think from the energy perspective, suburbia is a very interesting opportunity, mostly because you're dealing with a little more space than you are in a densely urban area. And so the type of solutions you can bring to bear are a little wider. You know, I think with any energy development kind of problem, it's about matching what are your natural resources, what is the space available, and what are the outcomes you're really trying to achieve. And those things together are different every time you look at a new plot of land, a new hospital, a new urban redevelopment center. And so it's about knowing and kind of sorting through how to kind of co-optimize as all of these other outcomes are being achieved, because you can plan well and to allow for adoption of innovation, especially on the energy side. Down the line, you've got economies of scale that hit at a certain point, maybe at a 10 megawatt scale, that don't hit at a 500 kilowatt scale, that don't work at a residential scale. And so it's about knowing what you've got and kind of what's the right size for your application. I think suburban redevelopment gives you a lot of options and a lot of flexibility to really dig into solving some of those problems.
Let's segue into the technology aspect of suburban innovation. Technology is obviously leading economic growth in the United States. What kind of technology has arrived to suburbia? Where is this technology going? Let's talk about the potentials, the risks, the unknowns. Start with Ellen and Jenny, since you're both very directly in these experimental and very risky spaces of technological innovation.
So from my perspective, I think there are probably 2 or 3 different buckets of innovation that I find really exciting. And one is actually on the hardware side of things. And so you're talking a solar panel or an inverter or a biogas plant or what have you. There's a CHP, combined heat and power, so for district heating, something like that. And those technologies are continuing to get better. I mean, solar is kind of my area of expertise, and energy storage is coming right behind it, which is going to change the game, dramatically. But solar is just getting cheaper, and the application space is getting broader. I think you can see one of the projects that we built right around Boston, and it's on a garage top canopy. And what that really is engineering design and innovation to do that cost effectively, because that's not exactly a cheap way to build solar, right? And so being able to really bring a project like that to bear is kind of going back to the what do you have, what are you trying to do, and how can we move this forward? So I think the technology is continuing to get cheaper, which is great, because that's going to allow for a better opportunity set to go chase. And then on the other side of it, people are interacting with the grid differently. And I'm very bullish on the ability for, traditionally, you've got a whole host of centralized power plants. They pump power through the transmission system, pump power through the distribution system, and every time you want to turn on the lights, it's there. And that's pretty incredible, right? That the grid can do that. But we're starting to see just a host of distributed assets that work together with each other, that work together with consumers, and really being able to take advantage of an economic arbitrage around creating a better outcome together. A little bit of storage gives you a lot of flexibility with your application space. And I just think the realm of what's possible is really accelerating, which is exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about technology. I mean, from the self-driving perspective, I think it's important to note that in 2007, MIT had an entry into the DARPA Urban Challenge. It was this huge Land Rover, and it was full of computers. So many computers that it generated so much heat that it needed a separate air conditioning unit. So much power that this vehicle needed its own generator on top of it to be able to manage all of that. And this huge vehicle, where all of the sensors were probably more than the car at the end of it, was tested in Union Point when it was a naval base. That was the only place that was near MIT that could be an open space where they could put this huge, massive machine to practice its technology before it went into the competition. 2 of our co-founders were there, and now they're here with our own. But you can see from our vehicle, this is a lightweight electric low-speed vehicle. This vehicle does not go more than 25 miles per hour. It is electric, and it can just be charged with any standard plug. And you can see the sensor packet. The sensor packet is much, much smaller. So again, from the hardware side, innovations in terms of taking all of the sensors that were used in 2007 and bringing them down to 2. We have LiDARs, which are sort of radars with lasers, and we have them kitty corner so that then you can provide a 360 view. We also have cameras. So we have cameras that provide depth perception. So you have two cameras, and then these two cameras can see a bit like your eyes. They have to be slightly apart so that then they can have that depth perception. And that's a lot of data. Our brains, our bodies are really complex machines, and we tend to underestimate them. But when you take a moment to think about everything that our body is doing as we're processing data, as we're internalizing, as we're able to decide, oh, there's a step there, that's how I get down the stage, this is how I get out of the door. Well, we're trying to teach computers to do the same, and that takes a lot of data, it takes a lot of algorithms, it takes a lot of inputs. And one of the things that we've seen from even 2007 to today is just how much all of this capacity of data processing has gotten much, much smaller. So NVIDIA has been sort of on the cutting edge of this. And so that's one of the things that's facilitating this, is being able to take hardware, reducing it, put it into a small vehicle, and still be able to process, and process quickly. That's the other piece, because as we're driving, if you drive, you're making decisions in a split second. So you have to have the type of technology that's going to enable that as well. So I think on the hardware side, that's possible. I think innovations around neural networks, for the longest time, sort of machine learning was sort of kept in its own little box, but once we expanded it to thinking about how does that apply to neural networks, sort of the world of algorithmic design really exploded, and has enabled us to really think about how to process all of this data in a much smarter way. And then just generally, having access to the internet and smartphones, where now we can order vehicles. We can have very sophisticated dispatching systems. We can track what's happening to our vehicles, remotely because of, cloud computing. So there's all of these different pieces, and it's very much about how do you take them and bring them, learn from them, and internalize them to create great products. And so I think from our perspective, we're really excited because this is the time when a lot of that innovation is happening, and we're really trying to just take advantage of it to move the technology forward and be quite disruptive in transportation and mobility.
So there's so much potential, there's so much excitement in both the self-driving and solar spaces, among many others. How do we make sense of all the different technologies available? Why are we getting involved in these risky and unknown technologies? Jake or Kyle?
Well, I know at Union Point we were confronted with a choice. We were building this new city from scratch. So if we'd followed conventional, methodologies that we'd employed across the country, we would have just gone right into building. Instead, we spent 2 years planning and preparing. And I'm really glad we did that, because we got to meet people like GE that have become great partners to us, and they've educated us about the potential of distributed heat and power and the potential of innovations in sustainable energy, and then folks like Optimus Ride, who come and research on our property every day. And what we ended up concluding was that, sure, we can create a built environment that's technologically advanced, but what a great opportunity to create a living laboratory too. If we just made a little extra effort, throw out a wider net, we could invite folks to come and experiment. So we'll be building collegiate space, academic space on the property. We'll have an innovation center that will be there for open source data to be shared, and we've invited the research community, people that create products and technologies to come and experiment. So like in the case of AV, we were confronted with a fundamental choice of do we try to build the optimal road for an autonomous vehicle, or do we try to replicate the road of Boston?
That's interesting.
Without the potholes, perhaps, but with kinks in them and narrow lanes and things like that. So we opted for the latter, and so where we're able to assist Optimus Ride is we own everything. We own all the roads, all the sidewalks, we own all the buildings, we control all that. So we are in a unique position to be able to add or remove sensors or try new things or experiment, right? And so where we've ended up with all this is there are different audiences. There are people that will live on the property, and they break into two distinct groups. There are people that will come work at the property, which we hope will be a very, very large group. The indications are that will be. And then there'll be people that will come to enjoy the amenities, restaurants, and sporting events and things like that. So they have different needs and interests. Technology can help foster all of that. But the key, I think, is to never stop being a laboratory and create an environment that can continually adapt continually into the future.
We need technology for parking, I would say, and that's what actually excites me most about autonomous vehicles. Two things happen to be true about parking is that there is way too much of it and nobody can ever find a parking space. And and that issue is actually probably the biggest decelerant of new exciting development that I see on a daily basis in Newton and elsewhere in Greater Boston is people just fundamentally don't trust the transportation demand management promises of developers, mostly because of the conceived traffic and especially of the parking spots. I think I've read kind of the utopian and the dystopian visions of autonomous vehicles for either being amazing for parking or for being terrible for parking. Obviously, I'm rooting for the latter, but even before we get all the way there, for a city like Newton that's already well developed, we don't have the ability to kind of plan from scratch and to plan with the kind of foresight that you're demonstrating. We need a market maker to help people who have an excess supply of parking find other valuable uses for it, whether that's parking or whether that's actually something else entirely, converting it to housing, which is, sounds promising and exciting, but it's quite expensive, or using it for storage or whatever. And we need, I think, local governments to catch up with that thinking. We're doing it slowly. We're lowering the parking thresholds. I don't think we're lowering them enough. And it's this iron triangle, at least in Greater Boston, between the local government, who can set the parking requirements, the state transit authorities, and then the private sector. And everybody's got to kind of trust everybody else that, hey, I'm going to have less parking, but then transit's really got to be there, and then the private sector's got to actually do a transportation demand management plan that they follow through on. And the question is, who moves first? And I'm not sure it's totally clear. I think, in general, when it's risky, you want the government to move first and take some of that risk out of there. I don't know that we're doing a good enough job of that, and I think a piece of technology or a high-tech, low-tech hybrid that can give people more confidence that, seriously, you'll have enough parking, even if it means it has to cost more, would be really promising, would be a catalyst for us.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on the heaven or hell situation, I mean, that is a very real conversation, because the race is very much between the startups and the OEMs. The OEMs, what they're trying to learn from the technology is how do they put it in their vehicle so that then they can sell that for individually owned vehicles. Whereas, where a lot of startups and where we include ourselves is we think of autonomous technology as an enabler. Having the autonomous plus the shared plus the electrification of the fleet, that to us is sort of the trifecta of that you need in order to really build a sustainable mobility system. And that's where we try to focus on for exactly that reason. How great would it be to have urban zones and even suburban zones that are pedestrian only, that are family friendly, that are safe, for you to play with your children or your pets, because you don't need your vehicle to take you to that spot, to get out of that spot, to then do your activity, get back in your car, and then go home. These types of technologies are enabling that type of mobility. And so that is very much the goal and what we're trying to push for. And what's been interesting, we've also been having conversations with folks that are building parking structures, and they are actually thinking about the height to the parking structure, so that then they can think about actually repurposing those structures, and then seeing how the government is playing a role and being there on the transit side with the commuter rail or subway, plus these types of first and last mile solutions, to ultimately say, what, we proved it. You don't actually need this parking structure, so now we're going to turn this into retail or some other use.
It's interesting. Talk a lot about cities, and people typically talk about parking as a major variable of a challenge of cities, but parking is a challenge of suburbs too. Yes. And I was thinking, in the town where I live, Brookline, we actually don't allow people to park on the street between 2 and 6 a.m. It's an idiosyncrasy of Brookline. Once we have self-driving cars, I'm imagining you could just have your car patrol the streets for 4 hours until it can park again, right? That would be an unforeseen consequence.
No more vehicle miles
parking
traveled.
ban. Let's move past parking to the business side of suburban development, especially with respect to innovation districts. What's the business model here? Is innovation space in the suburbs more profitable than the traditional model? Why are we shifting toward this dimension of developing suburbs? Let's start with Kyle.
Well, I know in our case, if we were looking at the traditional office park, the numbers are well known in the marketplace. So that's actually not a hard sell. There may not be a lot of demand, but the comps are there to support the economic model. You start talking about building a real urban environment down there, it gets trickier. So we had an advantage, however, and that is that when we were asked by the local governments to make a city, and this wasn't our idea, this was the local people requesting this. We had held charrettes and collaborative meetings. A lot of people came. We let the opposition come. Everyone was free to brainstorm together. We didn't moderate it. And the result was a city request, which we told them was impractical and unlikely to be successful economically. They were really insistent that they wanted the urban environment, they wanted the jobs and tax revenue and amenities, and they asked us to figure out how to make it work. The best thing we could come up with was the role that they play, which is the regulatory environment. So we told them, listen, one of the things that's unique about Boston that really stifles growth is not just the cost of housing, but it's the permitting and the regulatory environment that you work in, right? And so it can take 8 years to build a Class A office building in Boston and then occupy it. What if we were able to offer something to people that was more affordable, close to where they can get affordable housing, was cheaper and could be produced quickly? That might work. And we told them we don't have any guarantees it will work, but we'd pursue that model. And it's working. It's incredible. We have companies that have come to us from Western Europe and across the U.S. that may have a time demand, maybe they have a Made in America imperative, and they've got to be open in 2.5 years, or they're outgrowing space and there just isn't any way to find it in the city of Boston in time. Or they just simply don't like the idea of their people having to devote an hour and a half to 2 hours every day on average getting in and out of the city. And so within 15 minutes of our property, everyone from the CEO to the person that sweeps the floors can find housing they can afford. And so that frees up about an hour and a half a day that could be used for all sorts of other things. And so we began to put together this sort of toolkit of advantages, and it's resonated with people. We're 9, almost 10 years ahead of plan, and we're only a year and a half into our sales. So we have millions of square feet of residential and commercial committed already. And they're coming because it's this. It's not an office park. They wouldn't have come. And so we're setting a new economic model that transcends the region and starts moving closer to the 128 high density office model and the resi model too. Our comps are our own, they're unique to our place.
So the dimension of time is critical. You're able to get in there quickly, build quickly. It allows for a new business model, allows to adopt some additional risks that you might not have if you had to take 8 or 10 years to build this.
That's right. So we have a 28-day approval process. That's it. You file in 1 month, you're approved, and it's done. That's it. There's no prolonged debate, and then you simply file your building permit. So we have multifamily developers who have broken ground in 5 months at our property, where it would take years of fighting and legal battles to achieve that anywhere else or be denied. You can do it like that. So it takes away the economic risk.
Jake?
Housing. I'm not going to claim to know the particularities of the business model on the development side, but every developer that comes to our area makes a strong case that housing is economic development, and they're not going to build office space, and they're not going to build commercial or retail if it's not within walking distance of housing. And I think cities too often think of it as a carrot and stick. We're like, all right, we'll take the housing, we don't really want it, but we want the commercial. It's a higher tax base. It's easier to sell to our constituents. I think we need to think of it as an emergent property. I mean, innovation is not a place. Innovation is an emergent property of a network, and that network requires mixed of uses. You need the residential, you need the office, you need the retail, you need transit to connect them all. We need to think about it dynamically like that. And housing usually is the first mover in that equation, from what I've seen.
And Jenny and Ellen are representing two companies. One, a huge company that you could argue can afford to take risks, and one, a small company. How many employees are you, Jenny?
Oh, we're about 60 now.
16.
60.
6.
0. Yes,
Small
so
company.
We've been growing, but
Maybe people say small companies, it's easy for them to take risks, but it's also challenging. You want to talk about your individual perspectives on the business model for getting into these spaces?
Sure. I mean, for us, it is very much what's the value proposition? You know, is there an actual need for the developers? And at least what we've been able to find is yes. You know, to Kyle's point, you know, folks are asking for mixed-use development. They want to sort of have that urban feel without urban prices. And so part of that is these walkable, desirable, attractive commercial very dense sort of feel. And so how do you provide that? Well, you have to bring in all of these different types of uses, and you have to connect people to them. And they're looking for, sort of attractive amenities that can be in the space that doesn't just provide for the need, but provides a different edge that maybe is not in the city. And so that's where we seem to fit in. And so that's when we connect with the different developers and we say, well, clearly you're trying to provide these types of connection points to the different types of amenities that you're providing. And so we can do that for you, and you have this added value of it being self-driving, and you get to call yourself innovative. You get to call yourself being on the bleeding edge of what you can provide in your space, and that can is also quite strong from the marketing end of things, as far as how do you stand out amongst all kinds of different other developers. We've gone to some office parks as well, and that's what they're struggling with in the suburban areas. We don't have anything to connect our employees to, and that's part of the reason why they keep complaining. And so they're looking for having some type of mobility service that can connect folks in the middle of the day to lunch, or in the morning if they want to go work out and then go to the office. And that's sort of the opportunity that we see as far as being able to sort of close that gap in mobility for these folks.
And you think the time has come for this technology to be able to achieve this long sought for goal?
Exactly.
Connectivity. Yeah.
Yes.
I would just add that I think starting at kind of the end consumer perspective and working backwards, I think with energy in particular, you have to have a very strong understanding of your markets, of your local regulation, and how power is really bought and sold, and how power assets are really paid for and financed. Because the incentives typically don't align. If let's say you've got a consumer or a business and then their employees live next door, the employees will pay 19 cents a kilowatt hour, or something equivalent to that if they're here in Massachusetts. The business will pay 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and both of them have the right to go buy their own power. They don't have the right to string wires to power their own house, typically. They can put solar on site or what have you. But if those folks are wanting to go renewables, there are very limited options of how you can achieve that. If you have, let's say, a community solar plant on a piece of undeveloped or unusable land that can then sell that power to those consumers, that's one option. It means you're working with National Grid in the state of Massachusetts to make it so. Or if it's integrated into the system as a whole, that can be an added benefit. So when we're looking at an energy asset, a lot comes down to really figuring out who your customer is. Because if we can add value, let's say, to a big urban redevelopment center by 5 megawatts of solar and 10 megawatts of combined heat and power, some other form of generation, that's valuable, because at that scale, you can beat the grid. And that's really why a lot of this happens. People want renewable energy. Big businesses everywhere are demanding better options from their utilities. And to be able to serve that need allows you to open up your, redevelopment, your property to new revenue streams, because you're using your property to then turn it into an energy asset that can serve your actual end customers as well. And there are better options for doing that today than there were 5 years ago. And I think that's, for my business, that's where we really have to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. How can you make money selling the power? Who's it going to? Where is it, where does it need to be located, and at what size does that optimize within itself? Because there are probably different breakpoints of what's economic.
Can I just jump on there quickly, because we're working very closely with GE. They've opened our eyes to the potential of this. So the profit motive is important to drive innovation in the future. We're not looking at it as a profit center, but rather if we can create an environment where we can sustainably create energy and redistribute it, then it can be a value that's passed on to commercial tenants and residents, right? But we project we'll be 110, 120 megawatt energy user. We think we can only get to 60 with solar, the current configurations now. But the goal is to be 100% sustainable. So we need advancements in solar and all these other methods that are sustainable, which isn't going to be achievable if someone isn't making a profit, right? And so it's a negotiation with the GE and the Secretary of Energy from Massachusetts and then the energy provider to work out a deal that allows us to be innovators in that regard.
So you're building a solar field at Union Point?
We've got a landfill that's being converted to a solar field, and then rooftop ground-mounted solar. We'll have cogen, trigen, we've distributed energy. We'll have anaerobic digestion. These will all be feeding into this distributed energy system, and with battery power, we can then sell it for a profit back to the network when it's needed, or it can be used when we need it. But what it allows us to do is for a GE, they can come in and make a profit doing this on such a large scale. The end users can benefit by having cheaper power, and then we get to continue being innovators for decades into the future. As these technologies improve and new ones are created, we can be that laboratory.
I think you hit on a key point that it's all about working together with all of the stakeholders to really achieve kind of those outcomes, because you can't do it alone.
No.
As we know, Boston is not the sunniest city in the United States. So if solar power can work at Union Point, that's a great sign for the future of solar in Massachusetts, one of the nation's cloudiest states.
But it could also be wind. Geothermal might become something that's viable down the road. Anaerobic digestion has a demand need today, right? So there are other energy sources that we can tap into as well, and GE is guiding us through that.
Well, this is a really exciting dimension of the project that I think we'll really be interested to see play out. If we look up at this picture here, we see it full of people. I want to talk about people. The session's called Smart City, Smart People. Let's talk about the smart citizen. Who do you think they are? Some of them are living in Newton, but they're living all over the Boston region. What do smart citizens want? How are their demands going to change what we're all doing in our different professions? Let's start with Jenny.
Sure.
You really have to think about who your demand's coming from.
Yes, I mean, so we've already started to engage with some residents at Union Point as potential users of the service. And so we started to think through them as smart citizens. And the thing that our biggest learning is that being a smart citizen is age agnostic. You know, oftentimes people have this image of, you know, the young urban millennial with their latte and their avocado toast, and you know they're willing to try all of these different things, but that's just not the case. You know, we have that stereotype, but really when you get to know people on a person-to-person perspective, you realize that anybody is interested in learning how to make their life more convenient. Anybody is interested in learning about, you know, how the world is changing. Anybody is interested in trying different things. And so, you know, what's exciting at Union Point is that, you know, there's already a retirement community there. And they have been one of the first, the residents at the retirement community are one of the first to say, when can I try it? I want to see it, I want to experience, I want to use it. And just kind of seeing that. And it's really more about, you know, having that type of personality that you know that you don't know. I think that that's one of the things that a lot of smart people say, is that they know that they don't know, but they're willing to learn. And that's, you know, what we've found when we're talking to the folks that want to be early users of this service and really understand not just the technology, but what it means to them and what it's going to do for them. And that's what we think when we see the urban citizen. It has no age, it has no gender, it has no color. It's people who are just curious and open and excited to see what's going on and willing to have a dialogue about it.
Who are going to be your smart citizens, Kyle?
So this is an interesting question. See this rendering up here? The first version of this had only white people and no one in wheelchairs. All of the renderings were produced that way. And we sent them back and said that you have to redo them. This is not the audience of Union Point. We want people of color, every race, religion to feel welcome. We want people of different physical ability levels to feel welcome here. We're going to consciously go out and try to attract people with disabilities to come live at Union Point. I have a friend named David in London who is an advocate for wheelchair access, and David says, I'm not disabled. People build environments that make it difficult for me to get around, but I'm mobile. So why is it on me that I can't get over that curb? Why isn't it on the person that put the curb in? And so we're deliberately trying to create housing that breaks the mold, that allows for shared housing for people with disabilities, to create an environment that promotes cultures coming together and acceptance of one another. And so something as simple as, you know, falling into the trap of creating a rendering can send the wrong message to people that, so that we're having to consciously correct, right? And so our audiences within the property are consciously going to be split into two groups. So we're going from millennials and boomers. There's a good reason for that. In the South Shore, it's very hard to create new housing, so you've got a lot of folks aging in homes they should be leaving. If they left, the second time move-ups would move into their homes the first times, and then the entry-level buyers would come in. But everyone's stuck. And so what you've got are schools with single-family homes in walking distance, yet those families can't move out, and everyone's stuck. So we're consciously going after these two audiences that have overlapping priorities. We all understand why millennials would enjoy living in a very tech-advanced, very urban environment, but it turns out that a lot of the senior cohort actually want the same thing too. Affluent move down want the same exact environment. A lot of them are moving into the city of Boston from the 5-bedroom homes. And so that represents 45% of the general population. And then we're actually going after the other sort of, in Boston, half the population of people of color. We want that kind of demographic percentage in our city, and then we want more people with disabilities per capita. So the challenge back to an Optimus ride is, how does someone with Down syndrome summon your shuttle? How does someone in a wheelchair, John Kelly here, an advocate for wheelchair access, how does John get his wheelchair onto that? Or a senior who might be a widow who's not tech savvy, how does she summon that autonomous vehicle? So for us, the technology has to lead back to a human element that's providing a higher quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
I would, this totally on board with this vein. I would take a slightly contrarian view, which is that as a product manager, the first thing that I always try to do is remember that I don't ask my customers for features. I ask them for their problems and what outcomes they find important. And one of the dangers that I see, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience have seen, is that we let design and development be done by democracy. And I'm a little cautious of that, because I find a lot of times that a lot of the steps that you take to get to a great development and a great place are counterintuitive. Hey, I'm going to narrow this lane, I'm going to narrow this street, it's actually going to improve traffic, or I'm going to take away these parking spots, it's actually going to make parking easier, or I'm going to raise prices on this, it's actually going to make it easier to afford and to find. People don't buy it, and I think we need to be really cautious and frankly courageous in saying, we're going to prove it to you. We know that these are the outcomes that you're striving for, we know that change is scary, but we're not going to let this be done kind of totally bottom-up, designed by everyone gets their own vote. There is a huge element of a technocratic design element here that we need to embrace, I think. And that's a dangerous thing for an elected official to say, because I got to go door to door and sell it. But when these things are built, people love them. But when they're proposed, people hate them. And so we've got
Right.
the only way you're going to bridge that activation threshold is with some political courage. And I think we got to hold fast as we're doing that. And I'm sure the same thing is true with a lot of energy installations that go in.
Absolutely.
We had it in Newton for solar power in our high school.
Yeah, no, it's so true, because especially if you're doing, let's say, a parking lot redevelopment or green space. I mean, we very rarely do green space solar development. It's not the best use, typically, of brand new land. If you've got remediated land or something that's a little bit funky, that's hard to deal with for other purposes, that's kind of your better shot, especially in a semi-urban environment. But it is amazing, like the amount of stakeholder engagement that has to go into something as simple as covering your parking lot with solar panels. Because people worry about traffic flow. We built at a hospital, and we can't disrupt the ability for ambulances to come and go. What does that mean for construction? What does that mean for how you design the system? What are your clearances like? It snows a lot in Boston. Does that mean we're going to have icicles? Does that mean, things like that are very user experience side of energy development that requires a lot of engagement early. And I think that that's really the key, because I'm with you that everybody kind of hates the solar proposal when it's first, stood up. And then once it's built, it's awesome. And I would also echo the statement that it's the split demographic is, I think, a very, that's a very poignant way to look at that. We've built across, assisted living facilities and active retirement homes. We've built across schools. And it's there is no age limit to renewable energy or to innovation, kind of on that space. I think people, generally speaking, our customers typically are businesses and industries, and the things that we need to get right is it needs to be easy. It needs to adapt to our customers' business model, our customers' physical space, and our customers like economic opportunity. If somebody isn't comfortable with a 20-year energy asset, that's something to know. That's a difference in a customer set. But it's about being flexible, both on the business and technology side.
If I could just jump on one thing that you're both saying, and that was when we were asked to build this, one of the things that we insisted on, this gets into your utopian, dystopian thing, we said, all right, we'll attempt it, but you have to give us 100% control. So we don't go back and ask for permission to put solar on the roof. We don't have to. If we decide it's the right thing for an ideal that may not be important to others but is important to us, like being able to melt snow on sidewalks and crosswalks, if you're going to invite a lot of disabled people in, are they going to be limited in the winter months like they are in most of the Northeast? Well, you could solve that if you're working from a district-wide, but not if you have to go out for public vote and try to, so we insisted on that kind of control, and they gave it to us up front. So there is no debate about these things. We can simply decide to implement them, and if they're not working, we can change them.
Yeah, and just to echo Jake's point about it's really understanding the problems, really talking to people, really listening and observing, and that's a lot of what we try to do with the communities there. But we've also been working a lot with Perkins School for the Blind, and we've engaged with some of their high school students to understand from them, when they're trying to find the bus, when they're trying to find, a vehicle that they ordered, just looking at the problems that they have today with some of their mobility access, and you can learn so much from that. The sound, of a Prius, like all of those different things from issues that they've had today, and then how do we sort of integrate that as we think about the evolution of the product, which has been very useful.
Sounds like each of you have really learned a lot about society, even as you're operating in really different spheres of the development industry. That's very interesting. Of course, we hear a lot about millennials, but we're also an aging society, and we have to look at both dimensions of the social equation. We've got about 10, 12 minutes left. I want to just briefly get into the question of governance. What's government doing well? What could government do better? Short stories from each four of you.
I think one of the things that has been helpful for the AV industry in the Commonwealth and in Boston in particular was the executive order. The governor, knowing that if you tried to go the policy route, it's going to, just be drowned in committee, right? Just went the route of let's sign an executive order and then let's work with some of the cities and give them opportunities to prototype or give them opportunities to pilot. And in fact, the New Urban Mechanics, they worked with the Media Lab to get feedback. I think it was with the city group that they have here to think about how do they bring out autonomous vehicle technology. And what they ultimately decided was doing zones, so geofenced autonomy. Because by doing that, they get the opportunity to engage with the companies that are doing it. They get to put it in a space so that they can learn from it. They can understand and take the insights necessary so that then they can incrementally expand the network, knowing what the use cases are, so that they can prepare their community to do so. I think when the Ubers of the world just kind of descended on a city and did whatever they wanted, I think they were very concerned about that, and so they wanted to take a very sort of proactive approach to the point that they've also assembled a AV working group, and they meet every quarter to talk about what they're learning and how they can take those insights so that they can basically put together a report to help move the AV industry forward without blocking it with policy. And so I think that has been a very great way that they've done it. But I think also there's a lot to learn. I think that there is a bit of a technology gap, and it's an opportunity on both sides for us as the company to educate, and for the policymakers to be open to learn, so that we can sort of, like I think we've said oftentimes here, have a very strong multi-stakeholder collaborative approach to really move these technologies forward. Because it is the case that if policymakers aren't making it easy enough to do, the companies will go to other places. And so I think that they understand that and have been very open and willing to work and learn, which we think is very exciting.
I'm going to ask the rest of you to speak 1 minute each. What's government doing well? What could it do better? Jake.
Kind of a non-sexy, non-tech answer. Litigation. I work at Liberty Mutual. We're an insurance company. Work at Solaria Labs specifically, it's our innovation arm. Big concern Liberty Mutual has about autonomous vehicles is autonomous vehicle gets into an accident and you have to file a claim with them. That's a product liability claim. That's not a personal liability claim. And the difference between there is that now you're not fighting an individual to say, hey, you made a mistake and that's easily reparable. You're now fighting a huge company to say your entire product fleet might be flawed. And you're going to get much more serious pushback on that. We got to figure out what it means if an autonomous vehicle fails and how to manage that claim process, because you don't want to set up a situation where neither side is willing to admit fault because it exposes them to too much risk. And then just to keep on going on that litigation theme, much more local, it's too easy to sue people over development, I think. Most developers I talk to, mental math, hey, I'll take 6 months, a year, 18 months maybe to get this through regulatory and get it entitled, and then I'll get sued. And that's another year right there and another bout of uncertainty, and it raises your cost of capital. And we've got to figure out a way that you still let abutters get heard because they have a right to get heard, but we've got to do it lower stakes, faster track, more predictable format. We can't be sending everything to court.
Kyle.
We're kind of the poster child of public-private partnership. The state has been a tremendous partner to us. They put in the T-stop, so it's 22 minutes to downtown Boston. They built a massive parkway that connects two highways right through the heart of our property. And then the local officials have shown tremendous courage in proposing to their citizens that they give us 100% control to build anything we want to any density. After the two prior developers had failed, it took incredible political courage to do that. So I give all the credit back to them. They asked us to do it, but then they gave us the tools as well. And the people voted unanimously to do that. So we went to Weymouth Town Council. We got an 11-0 vote there. And then this is an archaic form of government here in New England, but we have what's known as town meeting, and people vote by show of hands once a year at the high school auditorium. In both Abington and Rockland, the people unanimously voted for this vision. So, but that was because the political leaders led.
Excellent. Ellen.
And I would say on the doing well side, the state of Massachusetts in particular has a lot of very ambitious goals about adoption of renewable energy. And I think that sets a market that allows for developers like what we do to come in and say, I want to invest in making this market real for us. I want to invest in business here. I want to invest in deployment of assets, because there is a stable regulatory framework in order to know that we've got a market when we want to sell a renewable energy asset or sell renewable energy, because we do both of those things. So I would say that's one thing that is done well in Massachusetts, not done well everywhere, and it varies market to market. On the other side of it is development and technology move so much faster than policy. And so if we're waiting on regulation, if we're waiting on clarity, and it's not even about necessarily what the right policy is going to be, if it's one way or the other, uncertainty kills projects faster. If we know that something's kind of a rough policy to deal with, from my perspective, we can work with that if we know what it is. It's the not knowing that I think is very hard. And so the only other thing that is a challenge, I'd say, is kind of the nesting dolls of local policy, from a state to a county to a city. And that's just something that I think every developer has to deal with, that it's about being heard kind of all the way up and down that chain, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge to deal with.
Thanks to all of you. You've had a lot of great ideas. You're operating in really interesting places. You're at the edge of suburban redevelopment. We have time for a couple of questions. There's a cube that's being passed around. It's actually become a microphone. Questions?
Hi, thanks very much. Wig Zamor from Somerville. So let's say you chose to do this same kind of thing in the peninsula that includes Charlestown, East Cambridge, and Somerville. You'd be breaking a lot of laws, right? Because you're going across municipal boundaries. And there would be an awful lot of public engagement. Are there constructive ways you could think to try to accomplish the same feats in that context?
I know in our case, we actually our land sits in 3 towns, Rockland, Abington, and Weymouth. So we needed all 3 towns to buy into the vision, or we would have ended up with this, Franken City, where it would look like one thing hit the town line, and it switches to something else, and then so there was a huge risk for us that all 3 wouldn't buy in, but they did, to our astonishment. They left it alone. They didn't tinker with it. So we're very, very fortunate in that regard. I can't even imagine what the outcome would have been if it had been other than that.
Albert, do we have time for another question? Another question.
Hi, Wade Vaughn. I work for a real estate tech company in San Francisco. I'll be an MSRAD student here in the fall. I'm a millennial. My parents are baby boomers. We're all moving to cities. Do you think autonomous vehicles are going to push people into cities or into these suburban redeveloped campuses?
Jenny.
I think that the goal is really to have smart development no matter what. And our goal as a AV tech company is to facilitate that. So if it is, that it is in a suburban space, but that is dense and it is bringing communities together and it's bringing, these different generations together, then, I think that the AV technology can be a strong facilitator for that. Because I think what we're trying to avoid is a bunch of greenfield development that just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading like a blob. I think if we're looking at suburban development that is still dense and it's bringing people together in pedestrian-friendly communities, then I think using autonomous mobility can actually be that great enabler, so that then when people are looking for communities to go to, then they're looking at all of these different amenities and they're getting them in more places than one and they're not being priced out.
Let's take another question.
Hi, good morning. Jose Miguel Simian from Chile. In your view, how is the minimum scale for such a project? Because I think if you have too few companies operating there, if one of the companies wants to move or something happens, you need probably a minimum scale for such an investment and operating this, also in terms of the community that builds and around this kind of city or small city in these suburbs. Thank you.
Kyle?
Well, in our case, we're very fortunate because we have almost 1,600 acres. So we set 1,000 acres of it aside as open space. So we created a buffer. In like Somerville, for example, if you were to attempt this on a small scale, you would abut a medium or low density residential neighborhood in all likelihood, and that would have a negative impact on their community, right? So it's hard to fit these things in and around the Boston area without having big disruption, right? So we purposely created a buffer, and so what we left ourselves was about 550 pure developable acres for high density development there. So in our case, we could end up with 100 major office buildings as an example, and 20, 30, 40 major pure housing buildings, and then many mixed together. I only know that. It's not like we've done this 20 times, so that to me seems like a great mix. It'll still take a very long time to build it. So, but that scale also gives the opportunity to look at innovations that we probably wouldn't have been tempted to look at otherwise.
Is there a scale that you need, Ellen, to operate?
To be honest, not really. There's a economic scale for what my business in particular wants to tackle. I'd say the smallest rooftop system we've built is about 250 kilowatts, which is pretty small. You look at a house, you'll fit maybe 5-7 kilowatts worth of solar on one house, and so. But it's really about what is the economic scale to solve whatever problem you're dealing with. If you've got because the state of play, I guess, at the beginning is that you've got a price signal coming off of the grid, and there will be a scale at which you can beat that. And that's really all it is. So I think from renewable energy, especially distributed generation in particular, and by that I mean solar storage, cogen needs a scale. We're talking 10, 20 megawatts worth of plant size in order to be able to serve a district worth of stuff. But for solar in particular, not really. It'll just be a business model.
Albert's standing up. I think that means we're out of time. So I want to thank our four guests. You're each excelling in your respective fields. I wish you the best of luck in what you're doing, and I want to see what happens.